What is mainstream education and how does it contrast to residential, you may ask? Well, first, let's start with mainstream school. What is mainstream school? Mainstream schools typically consist of deaf children that are placed in general public and private schools. These schools are taught using only oral language. Most of the students have no form of disabilities or special requirements. However, there are physical and psychological requirements associated with mainstream education. Over 75% of deaf or hard of hearing individuals are mainstreamed within the US. This may lead to feelings of isolation due to limited ability to interact. And next, we will visit total and partial mainstreaming. First, total mainstream. Your child may experience the exposure to the hearing world. There's greater opportunities to meet and interact with their hearing peers, possible discrimination against deaf culture, as well as shame of using sign language in a hearing environment. Additionally, they may experience peer rejection. Many hearing children are not exposed to deaf culture, and they may not be as accepting as other deaf children may be to it. Therefore, peer acceptance of children with disabilities is affected by others' understanding of that child's special needs. Partial mainstreaming is the non-primary placement of students with disabilities in regular classroom for only part of the day. This exposes them to the hearing world only minorly, and this also gives them time with the specialist teacher. It is important that parents understand how to work successfully with the school to ensure their child's needs are met. Should parents consider mainstreaming their deaf child, they need to be familiar with the child's rights under the IDEA, or Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. In this slide, we will visit the pros as well as the cons that are included with mainstream education. First, mainstream education provides opportunities to meet and interact with hearing peers. It also leads to greater exposure of sports, arts, and clubs, which is a wider variety of extracurricular activities. Also, if your deaf child would like to get more practice listening and speaking to communicate, this is the place. Students are held also to state and federal standards. The cons, however, include students can be singled out. Your child may be the only deaf student in the school or class, and sizes in some schools can be large, and the student can easily slip through the cracks and get lost, lacking academically. Additionally, the school may also be ill-prepared to meet all of your child's academic needs. Residential schooling provides the best access to deaf culture. This is where the school is naturally catered for the deaf or hard of hearing students and their respective needs. These schools are predominantly taught and communicated with in sign languages by specialized teachers of the deaf, who have better understanding and deaf awareness about their students than generic mainstream teachers may. Pros of residential schooling consist of things like hearing staff. Hearing staff cannot provide models of deaf identity and may have little to no exposure to ASL or deaf life. At schools for the deaf, the small size classes and caring, as well as the deep commitment, make it virtually impossible for a student to fall through the cracks. Commonly, these schools employ teachers who also have hearing loss, and ASL is their primarily communication modality. Living within a deaf community provides students the ability to become familiar and feel a part of the deaf community. Classes are taught in ASL so students can communicate directly with others without the feeling of isolation. Curriculum can include material specific to the deaf community, such as deaf folklore. Deaf children also have adult deaf role models. Three important contributors of maintaining culturally sensitive education for the deaf consist of anticipation, acculturation, and assimilation. Anticipation is the ability to learn and communicate effectively. Acculturation, however, is sharing of cultural knowledge. And lastly, assimilation. Assimilation is the new student's acceptance of deaf identity and pride in their culture. According to Knorrs, students who have attended public schools with their hearing peers have experienced a lower level of social well-being as well as a self-concept than their students who have attended special schools. Children who self-identify as members of the deaf community tend to be educated in school environments where they interact with their deaf peers as well as adults. They also tend to be raised within a family practicing deaf traditions and also to communicate in sign language. However, all these pros do not come without cons. The cons consist of fewer residential programs to choose from, so you may have very limited options in selecting a residential program for your child. Additionally, the curriculum of the typical residential school tends to be less rigorous than that of other schools, which leads to questionable academic standards. The key benefits associated with residential schooling is the exposure to deaf role models, the instilled sense of belonging, as well as their focus on abilities as opposed to disabilities. Now let's visit deaf education in the United States, a brief timeline. Starting in April 15th, 1817, with the first permanent deaf school established in Hartford, Connecticut by the work of Gallaudet and Clerk. The ASD was an establishment of many firsts in the United States. It was the first permanent school for the deaf in the United States. It was the first special education school in the Western Hemisphere. It was a recipient of the first allocation of both state as well as federal funding for special education in the United States. It was the first school in the U.S. to employ deaf teachers. It was enrolling the first African American student in 1825, which was during a time when integration was not only unaccepted but also illegal. Additionally, the ASD educated the first deaf-blind student, Julia Brace, beginning in 1825. The deaf president now was a student protest in March of 1988 at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. This protest began on March 6th when the Board of Trustees had announced its decision to appoint a hearing candidate, Elizabeth Zinser, over the other highly qualified deaf candidates. This historical protest also helped catalyze efforts to pass the American with Disabilities Act. Oralism was made popular in the U.S. around late 1860s. Oralism is the education of deaf students through oral language, using lip reading, speech, and mouth shapes. In 1880, a resolution was passed to promote oralism in deaf education worldwide, resulting in the dismissal of deaf teachers in deaf schools. By 1917, only 14.5% of teachers for the deaf were deaf themselves, which was a drop from 22% in 1895. This figure remained at about 16% between World Wars I and II, and then declined again to 11.7% by 1961. The National Association for the Deaf was created in 1880 by deaf leaders fighting for their community's rights to use sign language and have their interests represented at the national level. It is the nation's premier civil rights organization for the deaf as well as hard of hearing. In 1910, President Taft passed a law banning all discrimination against deaf people in the workforce, which was something that the NAD had been advocating for years. Following 1955, the NAD received various grants to aid in their efforts. In turn, they were able to build the NAD Law and Advocacy Center in 1976. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was then passed. The ADA is the most comprehensive disability rights legislation which prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities. Approximately 2 out of every 1,000 children are born deaf or hard of hearing. For children experiencing hearing loss, there are 4 primary communication outcomes, which of each are tied to an approach to language. There is the bilingual approach as well as the bimodal bilingual approach. Bilingual approach uses ASL as a language of instruction and English as the second language. Bimodal bilingual provides access to English as well as ASL using auditory and visual modalities. Contact signing uses English word order, fingerspelled English words, body language, as well as facial expression. Contact signing does not include MCE. Manual codes of English are combined ASL signs with invented morphemes. Manually coded English is a way of expressing the English language on the hands. Signs are used in combination with spoken English in order to express complicated or long ideas. MCE is not the best way to communicate visually. However, many hearing English speaking parents may use MCE with their babies. For total communication, SEMCOM as well as MCE, speaking and signing occur at the same time. It is the easiest communication modes for hearing peers that are not fluent in ASL. Cued speech is a way for deaf children to see spoken English. It is a system using 8 hand shapes and 4 hand positions. The cued speech method helps children to communicate with other people who use hand shapes that stand for all different sounds in English, possibly to improve their speech. To learn written English as well as other languages like Chinese. Cued speech is not classified as sign language or American Sign Language. While sign language uses hand shapes, facial expressions, and body posture to express expression and different concepts, cued speech uses hand shapes that stand for different sounds. Monolingual oral approaches focus only on spoken English, reading, and writing. Their goal is to provide deaf children with the opportunity to talk and become fully integrated within the hearing world. Some supporters of the oral method feel that if a child is allowed to use sign language, they will stop trying to learn to lip read and speak. However, sign language is a great way for a child to express themselves before their motor skills develop.